Well, hello, Life Group leaders. We're back again for session 3 in the book of Job. We're kind of skipping, as you know, and Richard did a good job kicking us off a couple of Sundays ago, knowing that we go from chapter 1 to 14. Today we're in chapter 19, and there's quite a bit of meat in between these lessons that we're having. So I think it'd be important. It was good for me to go back and review, and I want to do that just briefly this morning, the key points of lesson 1 and lesson 2, because that's the foundation today for lesson 3, and everything seems to be building to this crescendo of suffering that Job's experiencing, and some of the things his friends or maybe even well-intentioned friends, some advice they're giving, we'll talk about today. But let's go back to chapter 1, which was lesson 1. And there was something that jumped out at me this past week that I don't want us to miss. We talk about suffering, and that the book of Job is about suffering. But I saw a little Facebook post, and actually a lady in our class posted, that said Satan's goal was not to make Job suffer. In fact, let's look at that in verse, let's look, I'll find it here. We know that Satan kind of challenged God to say of why he worships you, but God then allows this, verse 11, but stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. So Satan's goal through the suffering was to get Job to sin and curse God. And so he's experiencing suffering. So if that's his motive or his plan here, and then we know what happened. We've been through that. He lost his kids and his property and his livestock and all the suffering that came about. So that was important. And then verse, still in chapter 2, even his wife wanted him. In 2 verse 10, he replied, verse 9, his wife said, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." She's basically, and can you imagine your spouse suggesting the same thing that Satan's suggesting?
Yeah.
But it says, I like verse 10, he replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And all of this, Job did not sin. So that's in the first lesson we talked about how Satan's goal was to make him to sin against God and curse God. So the overarching question we kind of started with is, why do bad things happen? A lot of times we want to say to good people, and I hate to kind of mark through that. I don't know if any of us are good. So just why do bad things happen? And we're trying to answer that question through here. Job's 3 friends we talked about in last Sunday's lesson. They had their opinions of why bad things happen, and each of them had their view of theology. And if I summarize this correctly, and you guys help me if I summarize here. But Eliphaz, his view is bad things happen to bad people, and on the surface that sounds kind of correct. A lot of times bad things happen to people who do stupid things or bad things, and some things are self-inflicted. We kind of know. So that seems on the surface to be somewhat logical, but we know that, that's not always true. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, or sometimes good things happen to bad. So you can't just settle on that one view, the Eliphaz. Bildad, his was similar. Bad things happen because of God's harsh judgment on sin. So, and they were convinced, as we know, that Job, you must have done something wrong. You must have sinned. You must. And he's like, no, I'm not perfect, but I don't have, my conscience is clear. I think you said earlier, Richard, he had a clear conscience and so he didn't accept that opinion, that kind of theology from Bildad. And then Zophar, he kind of had a combination where bad things happen to bad people, and God's justice is brought upon you, obviously, Job, because you've obviously done something bad and you deserve God's judgment. So these well-intentioned friends, I think initially, we see are now giving him some bad advice, and which is even causing Job to, as any person I think would do, is try to make sense of this or figure this out and even asking God, what is it? Help me understand. So that was kind of what was going on. We do see these friends today in today's lesson, and even in chapter 18 leading up to, there's the second cycle of discussions and opinions, and they were, it seems to me, very strongly opinionated. They were so convinced that they had Job's life figured out and the reason that he was experiencing all this suffering, and they were really disgusted with Job because he wouldn't agree with them. He wouldn't accept their view of his life, and they were really put out with him. So let me stop for a second and ask Richard and Tom, either of you got some ideas or thoughts kind of as a backstory here, pre-review of.
Well, the only thing I might, Gary, throw out is that when you're in a relationship and one of those in a relationship is suffering and you can't figure it out and you're trying to get your head around it and you can't, and you're trying to help by talking too much because sometimes you shouldn't give it, or you should be there. Well, if your advice is not heeded or if it's challenged, then it's easy to become frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
He's not listening to me. He's not getting what I'm saying, and I must be right and he must be wrong.
Right.
And I think in today's lessons, that's kind of what we see in these friends. So. They're getting angry, which is probably not uncommon in a cycle of what you go through. But they're getting angry and frustrated, and because it's like, you're not listening to me. Right. Kind of like a daddy to a kid, a little bit. So anyway, that's my
that's
thought.
Good. They were. It's obvious. Richard, any thoughts?
Well, we all have different perspectives on how we approach things. I'm going to approach this lesson. I'm going to take my class back into chapter 18, and we're going to talk about 18 and 19 together, because what we see in 19 is Job responding to what Bildad has said. And Bildad has said some pretty strong things. He's kind of got it all figured out. Well, you must be doing this or you must be doing that for God to bring this upon you. And what struck me in chapter 18 was the absolute, and you guys have kind of spoken to it, the absolute insensitivity of Bildad. And if you want an example of that, take a look at verse 18, where he talks about the person that suffers. This would be
18.
Okay. He says he has no posterity or progeny among his people, and no survivor where he used to live. And I was struck by, how dare he say this to Job? And not knowing what he is saying. Here's a guy that has just lost his prosperity and his progeny, and has no survivor where he used to live. I'm just thinking sometimes we say things without even thinking about what we're saying. And I'll give Bildad the benefit of the doubt that he's like we are a lot of times. But I just thought this was incredibly insensitive. And then you get into chapter 19, and you see just the anguish and the agony of Job as he goes through all the verses of 19. So I think we'll spend a little bit of time in 18 talking about Bildad and what Job is responding to. And then I'm going to take a little deeper dive, an expanded dive in chapter 19. So.
And 19, you almost get a sense 19 is very personal against Bildad, because Bildad's throwing all that stuff out of him. It's almost like, wait just a minute, dude. Yeah. And then he unleashes, and then he, of course, shifts. Our lesson primarily is where this shift comes, where he's clinging to his faith and his belief that down the road things are going to be different.
Yeah, and his loss up to now has been, we discussed it in terms of the, material loss, the loss of his family, and now we're seeing just the emotional draining and agony that Job expresses, much in response to what Bildad has said. At the time, you make a good point. It's almost like he, pulled a trip switch or flipped a switch in Job.
Yeah. I think all of us, before Gary gets kicked in, all of us have friends that most of the time it's pretty good, but sometimes it's not so good, and it becomes kind of personal. Right. And so there's that natural, who do you think you are, kind of. And that's almost what 19 can. So anyway, we jumped
No,
ahead.
no, that's exactly where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
And, I mean, we always talk about application, and yeah, this is a great story, and we can
Yeah.
kind of relate to it. But let's bring it up to today, and that's what you guys are saying about friends and relationships, and when is it a good time to give advice, when and we're on the receiving end of advice. How do we discern? I talk about the baloney detector. How can you be discerning and know when you're getting good advice, and when there's some advice you get, and I can even kind of go down the personal, whether it's divorce rates or whatever. I think a lot of families, a lot of people have reacted to bad advice. Well, you need to divorce him and get on with your life. Well, where's that at in the Bible?
That's right.
You know, and so we got to be really careful in the church and with people
That's a good
in our
point.
discussions. And it's never probably a good idea to try to play God in somebody else's life. And I may have a good idea, but at the end of the day, if I'm not directing that person to God then I'm giving bad advice. We need to be very careful. Got any thoughts on that?
No, that's a good point. Great point.
Yeah.
That's the lesson. Let's go play golf.
Yeah.
Or fishing.
Yeah. What you had something, Richard, to add to that?
Well, just one thing that struck me, and I don't know how it fits into all this, but as I was reading this lesson and studying this, one of the phrases we hear a lot, it's not one of my favorites, but you hear people will say sometimes when something comes along that's good, they'll say, well, it's a God thing. Mm-hmm. Well, in reality, everything is a God thing.
That's exactly right.
And
there you go, being logical again.
And so, Job didn't know, of course, of this conversation, as we talked about before, but, that can be extremely insensitive when something happens in somebody's life that isn't destructive in the sense that Job suffered the destruction, but maybe as a result of a certain thing happening. Let's say one person gets a job or comes into money and another one loses. I've seen that situation before where somebody said, well, look at all this I get because of this event.
Yeah.
It's a God thing.
Right.
And there's somebody else out there looking at the same event saying, well, this is a bad thing. Is that a God thing too?
Yeah.
So I don't know how that fits in here, but I think
it's
that
part of it.
it's just kind of something that resonated with me.
That's
in
good.
this
Yeah,
study,
and
so.
we know, and there's people in my class, our church, that are suffering, and some things that are going on that really doesn't make sense. I can't make sense of it. I don't know why. And I could be a Bildad as though well, you must have done something bad. I can easily jump to conclusions. Well, you just shouldn't have done that, and you wouldn't have resulted. So again, we have to take this study in Job that's pretty deep, bring it forward to us today to think through and be careful. And is everybody going to go through suffering? I think I've kind of come to the conclusion it's not if, it's when. That at some period in our life, some more major than others, will be events where we suffer. So anyway.
One of the things, I just add this, and I don't mean to go on, but I think it's a good point. Last Sunday, in our class, we talked about when you consider who Job is, and Job asked this, and we would ask it, well, this is a blameless person, a godly person, God's servant. Why is this happening to Job? Yeah, that's a good question to ask. But, Gary's big on the so whats, and he should be. We all are. But if we consider who Job is and ask, why did this happen to him? And we consider who we are and why certain things aren't happening to us, it really puts God's grace in right perspective and His purpose and the mystery of His will. So,
yeah, that is an excellent point. So it does, again, back to Satan's strategy. If I can bring enough suffering and enough bad advice and enough, my spouse even says, curse God, if I can get old Job to just cave in and finally say, yep, I'm going to blame God, all this stuff that I don't understand it, but it's his fault, and he curses him. But I can't find anywhere in here where he did that.
Right.
Through all the suffering, through all the bad advice, through all that, he held on somehow. When his sores from his feet to the skin of his teeth, it says today. I guess that's where the old saying came from.
Yeah, I wondered that.
Yeah. And he still held on. He did question, why? Help me understand. But he never let that question turn to where he was cursing God. He held on. So that's the goal today. So anyway, I thought of and I shared a little bit. I love all my old sayings. And one of the sayings that I picked up a long time ago is wrong facts lead to wrong conclusions, which lead to wrong conclusions, which produce wrong results and wrong actions. So a lot of times I think about that when his three supposedly well-intentioned friends were giving him some wrong facts and even some wrong theology. And if he had bought into that and gone along with that, that would have led him down that path.
That's correct.
So that's kind of today's lesson is
he withstood the pressure.
He withstood the pressure, and Richard said it felt the loneliness of being abandoned by his friends who were really disgusted that Job wouldn't buy into that. So part of the suffering, the emotional suffering, again, Richard talked about, is his disappointment. He was, I think, disappointed in God in a certain way that he didn't remove the suffering and he didn't understand. He was very disappointed in his friends who had turned on him and had seemed like he was just lonely because it seemed like everyone had abandoned him. So, in fact, in chapter 19, when you read, kind of starting in verse 1 down through there, and we're not going to read it, but part of it's kind of interesting. It seemed like a part he felt like God had wronged him and had drawn his net around him. It's almost like he felt like a trapped animal in the midst of things. He couldn't get out, and everybody had turned on him. Is kind of what it seemed like, and his disappointment there. And I heard a guy say, "Well, what is the definition of disappointment?" Well, it's when we expect one thing and get another thing. And so he was expecting some relief or answers or whatever, and he got a different thing. So I think he did feel some disappointment. So probably the most quoted verse, several verses that we've seen, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. We saw that in chapter 1. This verse 25 today, this verse that we have heard, we sing songs, some of the old hymns, I know my Redeemer lives and stuff, but 19:25, where somehow, some way, I can't even wrap my mind around how he was able to say, Job, I know that my Redeemer lives.
Yeah.
And that in the end he will stand upon the earth. The word Redeemer, we need to kind of come up with some synonyms. Our vindicator, our advocate, somebody who's got my back, somebody who cares about me. I think all those synonyms are appropriate for the word Redeemer. And I like how you use the word my. I know that my Redeemer, that personal, whoever this Redeemer is, I've got a Redeemer. There's someone out there. And so I think of the little four-letter word, hope. He had, it might have been the size of a grain of salt, but he still had hope that somehow, some way, in this life or maybe the next, he might have had to die in his own personal resurrection or whatever, that there would be a Redeemer for him. So you guys talk about Redeemer a little bit.
Well, I think it's a great point. And it's interesting if you read chapter 19, I guess verse 8, maybe the personal pronouns there, he has, he has, he has walled up, he has put darkness, he has stripped and removed the crown of my head. He breaks me down, he's uprooted my hope. He has also kindled his anger, considered me as his enemy. His troops, verse 13, he has removed. Over and over, he's talking about what he has envisioned God doing. And then, Gary, to what you said, but I know that he lives.
Yes.
That's an amazing thing.
Amazing statement.
He's in pain. You mentioned lonely. All of this he's going through. And he's talking about the sovereignty of God. You mentioned sovereignty earlier. Yeah. My class last week, that's what we talked about. The sovereignty of God, not only in the good, but he's sovereign in the bad. Right. And you've got to accept, if he's sovereign, you've got to accept all of that. So he's acknowledging that, but at the end, he makes this great statement, but I know he lives. And it reminds me of some of David in the Psalms. When David just very transparently pours his life out to us, man, he doesn't pull anything back. He talks about his pain, what others are doing, how he wants to get them, and all of that. But at the end of the psalm, he always comes back to some kind of statement of faith. Believe, trust, same word in the Bible, believe, trust, faith. That he clings to God and how God's going to either vindicate or rescue him or redeem him. Would that mean to pull out of the ditch, to escape, deliver, save? All of that's tied up in that Redeemer. So I just think that the pronouns are amazing
that's good.
here. And then caps with verse 25. He will take a stand.
So, Richard, didn't you think this is a little bit or a whole lot of foreshadowing of something with the word Redeemer in that verse?
Yes, I think that, one of the things that struck me as I was reading through this chapter, I tend to take things in bite-sized chunks. It's easier for me to comprehend the whole, if you will, and that's true of a lot of Job, by the way. But my thought is to organize around three aspects of Job's agonies here in chapter 19, and I'll just lay them out for you in the event that might be helpful for your organization for Sunday's lesson. But I'm going to focus on Job's torment in verses 1 through 12, which we've kind of talked about as a result of what he's just heard from Bildad, and then that loneliness factor, starting in chapter 13, and that really goes to, verse 13, running through verse 21, where he cites all those people that have abandoned him.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at those, he's got
That's a
such
huge
brothers.
form of suffering, that loneliness.
Yeah. His friends are gone. His relatives are gone. His servants are gone. His handmaidens are gone. His wife is even abandoned him in a sense. But then we get into, it's not the alleviation of the suffering in verses 20 to 29, but as Tom just alluded to, even though he's going through this, he doesn't doubt God. He really testifies to the fact that he is there.
Yeah, crazy.
He questions why, but he calls out to him in, just a few verses, 22, 25, 26, 27, in that penultimate verse of, I know my Redeemer liveth. And what does that have to do with anything? That last part of it that we can apply is, when we're going through really good times, and we can make a logical assumption, maybe Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar were going through relatively good times, somebody was suffering. And in our lives, all the time when we're going through good times, somebody around us is suffering.
Right.
And this just kind of gave me a sensitivity to that and made me think how I can be less like Bildad when things are going great, or I think I have all the answers. There are sometimes no answers that we can comprehend, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Good point.
So,
No, that's good. There's a sermon I heard a little bit of on YouTube, and the pastors, I think the title of the sermon is How to Trust God When Things Don't Make Sense. And I think that's what we try to do as humans. I think that's what his three friends tried to, and even Job. They tried to make sense out of this and couldn't. Now, the three friends were so opinionated, they thought they had it figured out.
That's exactly
It wasn't correct. Their theology, they chose their theology over their friend. Their view was what you did wrong, Job, and you just need to admit it and get on and confess. And so that was kind of interesting. I think a lot of times we try to make sense of things when at the end we can't. We don't know enough. We don't know God's sovereignty, His plan, His purpose. We may never know. And like Job, I don't think he ever get the end. Well, the reason for all this was, I didn't find that in the last chapter.
People have trouble accepting the fact that God owes us no explanations.
Yeah.
What we know about God and the workings of God is what He's chosen to reveal to us through the Scriptures.
Well said.
And that's it. He owes us no
Right.
explanations. Right. And it's easier maybe for us because we're not going through, at least right now, what He's going through. But they couldn't get their head on that. He's God.
Right.
He doesn't owe me anything. He's given me grace to bypass hell, but he didn't explain anything to me. He's under
That's
no
good.
obligation.
That's good.
But
And
and you know, when you speak to the difference between, and they're linked, of course, in some people's, there's the difference or the distinction to be made between faith and trust. Because a lot of people try to figure out God, and they come to the position in their life, you know, we either believe or we don't. And if we're agnostic, we don't believe. I mean, it's not like there's three levels: people with faith, people who are agnostics, and people that are atheists.
Right.
I mean, there's one or the other. And the people that are agnostic or atheists are trying to figure this out rationally, which is really what the three friends are trying to do. Oh, I got it figured out. When Job, well, he's done the same thing. He's trying to figure it out. But at some point, he just said, I don't know why this is happening.
That's right.
And he doesn't know, and he's tested himself as well. He's tested his conscience, as Paul did and spoke of in 2 Corinthians 1, I think it was. He said, I don't appeal to any court except my conscience.
Right.
Job did the same thing, and he couldn't find any reason. And it would have been easy for somebody to say, well, there must not be a God. And he chose to say, he chose to admit, even in the depths of this suffering, I don't know why this is happening. There's no reason I can think of that this is happening. What these guys are saying is wrong, but yet I'm going to trust God. He knows.
That's a good point.
And he's in control of everything.
Yep.
And I'm always, you know, we talk about the testing and the trial of Job. I think one of the things to keep in mind in this chapter and others is the testimony of Job for us when we go through suffering. You know, we tend to think about the trials of Job, the patience of Job and all of that. But really what Job is doing is living a testimony. And we've all had people maybe not on the same level of Job that have gone through suffering that, you know, we wonder, you know, how are they dealing with this? Well, it's through their faith. And then it causes the person that's viewing this and is amazed to say, wow, there really must be something to this faith that they claim. I want some of that. I want to talk to them more about that.
Yeah,
so
good.
God may be not just testing and trying Job, but giving Job a testimony that will speak to others as well. That may be, certainly likely is, one of the purposes of God in this mysterious thing that we're seeing in this whole book.
That's
so,
good.
Anyway.
No, good discussion. So let's kind of land the plane here and bring it around third, heading home, as Brother Matt says. Suffering. And well, I think back to, I think it's experiencing God, and Blackaby said God either allows things to happen or causes things to happen that draws closer to Him. So we know we started off today's discussion with, well, what was Satan's goal? It wasn't suffering. Yeah, he's going to cause him to suffer. It was to get Job to sin and curse God. And so it's like, well, Satan's, he schemes, he accuses, and so a friend of mine, he's actually a pastor, Carlton Brown, in Sardis, he put a little video out, and I thought it was very timely. I want to go through kind of as our so what, and I gave the guys, there's 6 things that Satan wants us to do. First thing is doubt God. And that's what he's trying to get Job to do, is doubt God. We think Adam and Eve in the garden, and well, God didn't say, or he didn't really mean that if you eat of this. And so if Satan's strategy to get us to turn and blame God and doubt God. So point number 1, he wants us to doubt God. Number 2, he wants us to live in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of our finances, the way we look, our relationships. And I think of Psalms 34:4. It says, I sought the Lord and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. Because sometimes we're fearful people, when, especially in suffering. And Job lost his health. He had sores, and a lot of times bad diagnosis from doctors, and go on and on. He wants us, number 3, to feel insecure. And that's a big deal. Insecure in our faith and our abilities. A lot of insecurity there. Number 4 kind of hits home with the whole COVID thing and laws and stuff, where we couldn't even get together for a long time at church. One of Satan's schemes is to get us to isolate ourselves from church, from our friends, our family, from life groups, from discipleship groups, from men's groups, whatever. And if he can, we've heard the old examples, if he can get one weak animal away from the herd or the crowd that's easy for the lions to attack, and Satan's the same way. Number 5, Satan wants us to be led astray. That's what the 3 friends were doing. They were trying to lead Job, even though it was well-intentioned in their own kind of twisted view of theology there. Satan was using them and their bad advice to lead Job astray, to get him to go back, and we read it in chapter 1, to curse God. He's using his wife to say, you need to curse God. And then, ultimately, what Satan wants us to do is fail and to sin. Whether it's cursing God through our sinful actions, and we all know that sin brings about guilt and shame and that broken relationship, and we feel unworthy, and we won't even forgive ourselves, and we won't even go to God and ask for forgiveness. And I actually wrote down, he wants us to feel so, and to question God, and actually to blame God for our circumstances. And if Satan can get us to do that, he's done to us today what he was trying to get Job to do way back then, is to blame God for his circumstances. So
that's good.
That's the 6
Blame
things,
God.
to blame God.
It's a lot easier to blame Richard.
Yeah, it's all his fault, right? So,
Oh, sure it is.
any other
Look at
thoughts
his gray
as
hair.
we wrap up today? Anything? Did we cover everything we
We
wanted
did.
to?
Maybe you got some there, life groups that might help you as you work through it. Don't get overwhelmed by all these chapters and trying to make sense of all this. This is just a series of cycles right now. And when Gary, I don't know if it was Richard or Gary was talking, and I probably lost my note here, but here's a great general outline for Job. The test of Job. Who said that? Was it you or him?
I think it was Richard.
Test of Job, the trial of Job. Eventually, we're going to get to the triumph of Job. That'll preach. It might be like a 4-hour sermon getting through Job, but somewhere along the way, we see little triumphs along the way. And so just don't get overwhelmed. Take the scriptures, do a little like Richard did, look before, maybe look after, and just bite out what you can, because you're going to get some great stuff here. Let me give you a little tidbit. Last week I taught, and I brought the little video after Richard did, and I struggled a little bit, especially that 3rd section on how to make sense of what chapter 14 was telling us. And before the class started, as I started looking back through those verses, the word until, that central section of those verses, hint at the resurrection.
Yeah.
And he talked about the tree being cut down. Even the tree comes back, but there's really no hope for, or is there, kind of. And there's a hint of resurrection. I looked, verse 12, until, verse 14, until, and there's another until somewhere, 12, 13, 14 have the word until.
Wow.
So there's that hint of, all the way through these verses, just keep digging, because you're going to get some food there to give your students. So anyway, great job.
Yeah,
Gary.
that's good. Well,
Thanks
that's all we
leading
have
us.
for today. Hopefully, again, you bring it down, land the plane, give them the so
There you go.
what. Every Sunday, I think it's important that we, as the teachers and leaders of our group, teach with begin with the end in mind, and the end is how to give personal application. How will it change our life as we study the book of Job? So, hope that helps you guys. Have a good week.
Good job.